dreary Bible passage, isn't it? Who's read the book of Job? Anyone here? Yeah, it's a bit hard to pull up from, really, isn't it? In March 2020, when the pandemic began, I found myself involved in an email conversation with a group of Christians about the reasons why God might have allowed the pandemic. One person was sure that the pandemic was God's judgment on a society in moral decline because of its disobedience to God. Someone else said they doubted that very much, and they thought it was much more likely that the pandemic was God's judgment on the church for becoming lukewarm and not standing for the truth. And I really tried so hard not to respond. But in the end, I couldn't help myself. So I emailed and I said I thought that the pandemic was God's judgment on the elderly and those with underlying health conditions, because that's the theory that best fit the data. The email correspondence ended at that point. And I didn't hear back from those people. I'm always getting into trouble for being flippant. Anyway, that conversation showed different perspectives on how God runs the universe. Does God send disaster on people who don't acknowledge him? Does he send trials to build his own people's character? Well, we've been exploring a little bit how God runs the universe in our wisdom series. And there are 3 books in the Bible known as wisdom books: the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. Now, you can read and study them all separately, but to get a rounded view of what the Bible has to say about wisdom and about how this universe works, you really need to pay attention to all 3. Now, so far, we've looked at 2. The book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. This week and next, we're just going to poke around in that final book of wisdom, the book of Job, just to see what it has to say. And kudos to Dion, who spoke on Job last year. I don't know if you remember that, but he raised some of the perplexing questions that this book deals with. And I'm going to build on what Dion has said. So you could check in with Dion sometime and just get a bit of a bullet point summary of the points that he raised. And like last week, I am relying on some scholarship by Tim Mackey, the Old Testament scholar who's behind the Bible Project videos. If you've ever read the book of Job, you'll know it's quite an unusual book, isn't it? It's got a very clear structure. There are these 2 introductory chapters of story that introduce Job and what happened to him, and a scene that takes place in heaven. This is followed by 38 chapters of cycles of dense poetic debate between Job and his friends. And then there's a speech by God. And then there's one last chapter of story that's kind of a happily ever after end to the book. Now that structure should immediately raise some questions about what kind of literature this book is. What genre is this? Because if there are 38 chapters of poetic debate and only 3 chapters of plot, it seems like it's the ideas in the debates that are really important, more than the actual events of the story. Added to this is the very first line of the book. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. Now, the land of Uz is a very, very long way from Israel, where the book originated. And it's almost like saying, once there was a man in a land far, far away. Biographies about historical figures don't usually start like that. And then there's this weird scene in heaven where God makes a bet with someone who disagrees with the way that God is running the universe. So, all in all, the book of Job doesn't really read like a history textbook. It's unlikely, I could be wrong, I always put that out there, but it's unlikely, given those facts, that this is an account of historical events that actually took place. Rather, it seems like it's a story that's used to explore some very deep questions about how God governs the universe, whether God is just or not, and how we respond to suffering. Understanding this really helped me a lot, because I don't know about you, but I always had trouble reconciling the ending, the terrible losses Job faces in the first chapters, and then there's a supposedly happy ending. You know, all of Job's kids die in the first chapter, and then they're all sort of replaced at the end of the book with other children, so, you know, it's all good. Well, you know, I have a bit of a problem with that, but when I understand what type of literature this is, I'm not quite so outraged at that seemingly callous ending. Job is introduced as the most upright and blameless person imaginable. Along with his 7 sons and 3 daughters, God has blessed Job with wealth and good fortune. So that's the very introductory few verses. What happens next is that the reader gets transported to God's, it's kind of like a heavenly situation room. You know, if you've ever watched West Wing, the situation room in the White House, it's kind of like that. It's the place where God governs the universe. And the sons of God are also there, probably to be understood as angels. Among them is Ha-Satan. Ha-Satan. Literally, the adversary, or the opposer, or maybe the accuser. Now, the role of this heavenly being, Ha-Satan, is the opposition to God in this heavenly situation room. A little bit, I think, like a prosecutor whose role is to accuse while the defence lawyer defends. And God points to Job, to the accuser, points out Job, and he says, Job is a stellar human being. And the accuser pushes back. The accuser said, you know what, Job is only good because you keep blessing him. If all of Job's blessings were taken away, would he still be a good person? Would he continue to be loyal to you if there was nothing in it for him? It's an interesting question to reflect on, isn't it? Are we Christians because of what's in it for us? Do we only try to be good because we think there's a reward to be gained? That's one of the questions that Job raises. Anyway, God he agrees to allow the accuser to take away Job's blessings. Now remember, this is not God making a deal with an evil devil to torture a real person. It's God agreeing to test the adversary's accusation that Job is only good out of self-interest. He's only faithful to God because there's a reward for being faithful. It's kind of like the setup to a thought experiment. That's what the first 2 chapters are. And it also gives us a heads up about something that Job doesn't know, that we know stuff now that Job and the other characters in the book don't know. So we're then transported back to earth, where terrible things happen to Job. His livestock is stolen. His servants are all killed. All of his children die when the house that they are in collapses on them. Job is struck with a skin disease, so that he's covered with boils from head to toe. And after all this, we're told that Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So far, Job is passing the test. He He's staying faithful to God, even though he's no longer blessed. But we're only halfway through chapter 2. Job is a long way to chapter 42. Next, Job's 3 friends come to commiserate. And when they see his suffering, they're so shocked that they all sit in silence for 7 long days. And then the speeches begin. There are 3 cycles of speeches, each of the friends giving Job their opinion of what's going on and what Job should do, followed by Job defending himself against them. The speeches, they're long, they're dense Hebrew poetry, but basically the friends' message is, Job, you must have sinned for this to happen to you. You need to repent, and maybe God will let up. You see, their view of the universe is actually quite similar to Satan's. Their view of the universe is that God rewards those who do good. And since God is clearly being punished, he must have done something wrong. And I wonder if you resonate with that. Were you taught that God rewards you if you're good and punishes you if you're bad? I think it's how most of us were probably parented. And it's really hard to parent any other way. Because if your child does something that shows kindness and compassion, well, of course a parent is going to encourage that. And if your child is kind of mean and nasty, then you're going to try and dissuade them. So even without God in the picture, we already grow up with a universe that rewards goodness and punishes evil. And this comes quite close to the picture that we've gotten from Proverbs, isn't it? That life goes better if you live wisely. And we've seen the truth of that when we looked at Proverbs. But when something bad happens to you, is there a nagging thought in the back of your mind? Maybe I'm being punished by God. But Job, he is certain that he's innocent. He doesn't know why any of these terrible things have happened, but he is sure that he hasn't done anything to deserve them. And of course, the reader knows that Job hasn't done anything to deserve them either, because we've been privy to what happened in God's situation room. And God also knows that Job hasn't done anything wrong. God said so. Job is not being punished for doing something wrong. In fact, the reader knows that these things have happened precisely because he hasn't done anything wrong. So what we have in the thought experiment of Job is something like this. You see, the book of Job sets up this triangle, and then it explores if all 3 statements can be true at the same time. And it becomes clear as we move through the speeches that all 3 statements cannot be true at the same time. The question is, which statement is wrong? So, the friends of Job are certain that God is a just God. They're convinced of that. And the friends are certain that God runs the universe according to the principles of justice. In other words, if you're a good person, then God will reward you for being good. And if you're a bad person, then God will punish you for being bad. God is just, and that kind of seems like a just way to run the universe. But because the friends are certain about those 2 statements, they conclude that Job cannot be innocent. He must have sinned. And I wonder if anyone has ever concluded that about you. I wonder if you have concluded it about someone else. throughout the book, he never wavers even a fraction from this. And he also assumes that God runs the universe by rewarding people who are good and punishing people who are bad. So the only conclusion that he can logically come to is that God is unjust. Because he, Job, has done nothing wrong, and yet he's being punished by God. After chapters and chapters of Job, he's just desperately trying to figure this out. He finally does this dummy spit. He says, I did everything right, and you, God, abandoned me. He says, I cry to you, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you merely look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. It's an emotional roller coaster for Job, trying desperately to figure this out. And I've seen it over and over in my life. When tragedy strikes, often the first question that I see people ask is the why question. Why me? What have I done to deserve this? Is there something inside us that demands that if the universe is run by a God who is just, then we should be rewarded for doing good things and punished for doing bad things? So when bad things happen, there's this inclination to believe that this must be punishment from God. So we either blame God for being unjust, or we believe that somehow we're at fault. There must have been something that we've done that's the reason for this bad thing happening. And so we pore over our lives trying to find some secret sin that we didn't know about, something to repent of. But the book of Job has something really important to say about that. We readers, we have an advantage. We've been given that inside information from the Heavenly Situation Room. We've seen things from God's perspective. God has stated very clearly that Job is innocent. And God claims that God is just. The reader knows that at least in this one case, the universe is not operating according to the principles of just retribution. The good are rewarded and the bad are punished. Instead, there's this weird test going on. If we get nothing else from Job, we should at least understand that when bad things happen to people, we should never assume that it's punishment from God. When tragedy strikes, we don't have to torture ourselves trying to figure out what it was that we did to deserve this. The thought experiment, that is the book of Job, calls into question whether the universe really does operate according to these strict principles of just recompense and just retribution. It calls into question whether the justice of God requires that God always rewards good and always punishes evil. And we'll poke around in that a little bit more next week, and we'll discover that the universe is a much more complicated place. After the 3 cycles of speeches, another friend speaks up. This guy called Elihu, and he sort of appears out of nowhere. We didn't even know that he was there. But he's angry with Job, because Job is trying to justify himself, and he's calling God's integrity into question. And he's also angry with the 3 friends, because they haven't managed to refute Job. And so Elihu starts in. His speech is long. It's really, really long. 5 chapters long. He is very confident that his answer is superior to the answer of the 3 friends. He's got a slightly different view of what Job's suffering means. The 3 sides of the triangle are unchanged, but there's a small nuance. Maybe, he says, maybe Job hasn't sinned. Maybe Job hasn't sinned yet. Because who could know whether Job sinned or not? But God knows everything. In fact, God knows what sins Job is going to commit in the future. And so the suffering sent by God is to punish Job ahead of time, or perhaps to warn Job ahead of time, don't commit those sins. And if Job takes notice, then perhaps he can avoid the sin. And in this way, his character will be shaped by the suffering that he has in the present. Does that sound familiar to you? This is the person who, when tragedy strikes, just ties themselves into knots, trying to work out what God is trying to teach them through this suffering. Maybe they're meant to learn patience. Maybe they're supposed to become stronger in their faith. Or maybe they're supposed to be praying more fervently. There has to be a reason for their suffering, and they must be able to figure it out if they just think hard enough or pray long enough. Do you know, at the end of the book, we discover that God isn't impressed with any of these answers. In fact, God prefers Job's emotional roller coaster with what's happened to the simplistic answers that the friends have so confidently given. He prefers Job's dummy spit than the friends' confident answers. God does have an answer for Job, and we're going to look at that next week. But in the meantime, we found some wisdom from this thought experiment. The book of Job has raised some questions for us to reflect on. Does God always reward the righteous? Does God allow suffering for reasons that we just don't know? Is suffering always tied to sin? Can suffering be undeserved? And if so, what does that say about God? Sometimes, of course, suffering is the result of our own stupidity, isn't it? Sometimes we just do stupid things. We do careless things. And we do hurtful things. And we suffer as a consequence. Sometimes we do need to repent. Sometimes we do need to learn something. Sometimes we need to stop doing stupid things. But those times, they're usually obvious. It's kind of obvious what's caused this. But sometimes tragedy strikes and there is no obvious answer. Paradoxically, I think, in discovering that these questions don't have simple answers, we can actually become more resilient to the suggestion that if we're suffering, we must be doing something wrong. There must be some secret sin in our lives. It must be something we haven't repented of. It must be something we need to learn from this suffering. Sometimes the answer is simply to crawl into God's lap and say, I don't know what's going on, but I trust you. I don't know what's happening, but the book of Job helps me to understand that sometimes I just need to trust.